large university, so I'm entirely comfortable with seeing people nod off in front of me. If that were to happen after a good meal, I won't hold it against you for that reason. But I was asked to make just a couple comments on the background to some of these things, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. As I've shared with my table, the idea for this book came to me. Number one, I wanted to publish a book. I work in the publishing industry, or I did at that time. I had ambitions and still do have ambitions to write books, and so this was an idea I had. It came to me because my first wife was an exceptional cook, and one year I bought her what today is a collectible. It's Vincent Price, the actor, and his wife had assembled a cookbook called, I think it's called Treasury of Great Recipes. It's got an elaborate gold cover on it. It's a highly collectible item today. If you look at the table of contents, it was really 50 of their favorite restaurants around the world, meals from those restaurants. One of them happened to be the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway dining car department. And back in the day, that's how executives from the entertainment industry got from New York to Hollywood. And that was the Century and the Chief. That was the 20th Century Limited from New York to Chicago. Changed trains in Chicago to the Santa Fe's Chief, which was a 39-hour run from Chicago to LA. And so he would have been familiar with that. Now, I knew enough about railroad history to know that if the Santa Fe did this right, at that time, which was the 1920s to the 1940s, there were 119 Class 1 railroads in America. Now, that doesn't mean much, and don't ask me for the definition, except that I know it has to do with the number of tons hauled, the number of miles they're hauled, and it's a measure of how big a railroad is. Today, there are only 4 Class 1 railroads in America. That's the Union Pacific, the BNSF, Norfolk Southern, and CSX, so it has shrunk dramatically. But it led me to start researching what the other railroads did in addition to Santa Fe. And that's where I came up with the idea for doing this book. And it took me, now this young woman's a writer, so I told her it took me 11 years to write the book because we wanted to discourage other writers. We don't need competition. But it did take about 2 years to collect the recipes that are in Dining by Rail. I've already indicated it's representative of what would have been a railroad food service manual, how they trained their chefs. About 325 recipes. It covers all meals of the day. And then I set about trying to find as many as I could. I wound up with 48 railroads. Well, 46 railroads plus the Pullman Company, which built the cars, the dining cars, and the Fred Harvey Company, which operated eating houses along the route of the Santa Fe Railroad. Some of those other Class 1s, like the Virginia. The Virginia was a Class 1 railroad, but it did not have long-distance overnight trains. So they had, at one point in their history, had 4, what you would call like a bar lounge car, or a lounge observation car. So it did have light meals, but they were day trains, so they didn't really have dining cars that served breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the way that some of these railroads did. So that's kind of how I collected these recipes. I thank my word processor in my acknowledgments because I corresponded with more than 300 people to find these recipes. And it was serendipitous, as many things are. I mean, I was helped greatly in testing the recipes because I was working with food manuals and no chefs to interview. So, 40 portions. You're not going to do a cookbook that shows how to make 40 servings of cream of lima bean soup. So you had to reduce them, and then I shared them. My good fortune was there was a professor at Penn State who taught food preparation for the hotel restaurant management program, whose father had actually operated a station eating house at one time. So he kind of had an interest in this subject. So I would reduce the recipes from my own knowledge and reference books I had, type up any questions I had, share them with Pete Bordy, and then he would either answer my questions or make some suggestions. But with one exception in the book, I didn't change any ingredients. Those are historic recipes. That's why you're going to find recipes with lard, salt pork. The salad dressings are made with mayonnaise that's made from scratch. Now, some of that stuff's fallen out of favor today. We weren't as health conscious in the 20s, 30s, and 40s as we are today. And of course, eggs, using raw eggs to make mayonnaise is not favorable either. So there is a little section at the beginning on how to substitute, for example, bacon for salt pork, what you can do to substitute for lard, and recommending how you can measure prepared mayonnaise to be the equivalent of what the recipe produced for the salad dressing. But that's how these things are tested. this particular dessert, I would test recipes on Sunday, and then I would go to my neighbors with leftovers. I was preparing for 6 occasions in my family at that time, only 4, so I had leftovers. But this recipe, people would come by and say, "Are you making that strawberry sundae again?" That sort of thing. So there are a lot of requests for that. How this evolved. So what most of you may not know is that at their high point, between the 1930s and the 1920s to the 1940s, probably the best chefs in America worked for the railroad. And I know that because they won prizes in all the culinary competitions. I did find a box of prizes in the Milwaukee Road Archive up in Milwaukee, and it was all the blue ribbons that the culinary department had won in their competitions with. In those days, the competitions were country clubs, resorts, hotels, and railroad dining car operations. Those were the big 4 of the food preparation industry. And the railroads just would clean house in those. There was a biographical sketch in the book of a fellow by the name of George Rector, who today would be maybe like Paul Prudhomme or Jacques Pepin. Famous chef. He owned restaurants in New York and Chicago, which I believe were shut down by Prohibition. And so he wrote cookbooks, he did cooking demonstrations all over the world, and he was hired by the Milwaukee Road as their chef de cuisine. So he designed menu items for that railroad's trains in their day. And so then you think, well, railroads, the best chefs in the world, were working for the railroad. How'd that happen? So just a very short history of this. Of course, the first scheduled passenger train to run in the United States was on Christmas Day in 1830. It was the Charleston and Hamburg Railroad, ran west from Charleston, South Carolina, 9 miles, probably to a tavern somewhere, because that's how far they built the track. And it took 3 hours for that train to go those 9 miles, all right? Wow. In all likelihood, the management of that railroad wasn't concerned with feeding those people. As one of my friends said, you have to figure it started at a bar and it ended at a bar, so there's probably stuff to eat on the end of the trip. And early railroads in the 1830s, 1840s, they were really built. That railroad was built to haul cotton to Charleston to be shipped to Europe. There was a railroad built near where I lived in central Pennsylvania that hauled ore from a mine to a pig iron furnace in State College. They were built short distances to haul a product from one point to the other, but railroads caught fire. I mean, they were the internet of their day. And so very quickly, those little railroads started to consolidate and cover greater and greater distances. So while the managements of the railroads may not have cared too much about feeding their passengers, the passengers learned that it should be a worry of theirs. Because that 9-mile, 3-hour trip, well, things could go wrong. First of all, the track in those days was very rickety, not like you see today, but it was laid on stones. They buried stones in the ground. They put cross ties between the stones. They put timbers along the length of those stones, and then they nailed strap iron to the top of that timber. And then that's what the trains ran on. So it was not uncommon for a train to go rattling off the track at some point. Farmers didn't like them. It disrupted the milking cycle for the cows and the egg-laying cycle for the chickens, and so farmers were known to sabotage those lines. Or even worse, their livestock would get loose and roam out on the track, and a little 2-ton locomotive hitting a 500-pound steer, both of them suffered as a consequence. In fact, the first account of a meal on a train that I discovered was written by 2 British fellows who were traveling on a train in Massachusetts in 1836, and the train hit a herd of oxen. And so they commented on the fact that the train had been knocked off the track, but we only experienced an 8-hour delay. And the only inconvenience was we missed breakfast. And he said some of the people on the train weren't happy about missing breakfast. And he noted that there were now lots of beef lying alongside the track. So they set to work on those dead oxen with their penknives and started a fire. And so essentially roadkill. They were eating basically roadkill. Others, you know, as a train would pass an orchard, some children might be there willing to throw fruit, you know, throw me a quarter and I'll throw you an apple, and that was a way to feed people. Sometimes the train crew would arrange, if it was a long run, they might arrange with a local farmer to have some food ready, and they'd stop the train and people would get off and eat, get back on the train and continue. But it was very hit or miss. And the other thing was that the trains had to stop every 35 miles to take on water and wood at that time. And so vendors would happen to show up where that was going to occur and offer food for sale. In fact, my working title for this book was From Soot to Souffle. Now, it did take my editor to say, you know, a book with the word soot in the title probably isn't going to sell very many copies, so we left that the name of the first section. But I also found an account from a couple Englishmen who got into a debate as to whether that was soot or flies on the food. And they were disappointed to learn that it was actually both when they got off the train and tried to buy something. So it was very not good. Now, what happened in railroad history that had an impact on this is that these little railroads continuously merged, so that by, the first train ran in 1830, by 1840, 45, I think, you could get from the East Coast to the Great Lakes. The railroad was completed in Buffalo, New York, and then eventually to Cleveland. By 1850, you could get from the East Coast to Chicago. And by 1856, the first bridge was built across the Mississippi River.